I chose epic theatre because I wanted to learn more about it, not so much its history and the performances done in that style, but about the inspirations of the creator Bertolt Brecht, and how the style has affected and changed theatre, shaped it into what it is now. It sounded different to the other styles of theatre in that it focused not so much on the characters and their motivations and conflicts, but on the plot of the play, and it was descentered from the people themselves and more on their relationships with the outside world, the audience, real-life events offstage, or even politics. Well, let's get into this. What is epic theatre? It is a style of theatre that has since disappeared almost completely, inspired by early German expressionism, devised as a way to enable people in thinking critically, mainly about political issues of the day. It was didactic in the way it worked, much like school, instilling many with new beliefs and convincing many of the problems of their society. The beliefs and morals it involved came sometimes from Marxism, which was a primary inspiration for this guy right here. We saw him before. This man invented dialectal theatre, or what we call left stuck, nearly single-handedly. You can bet that it was a good thing, this dialectal theatre, because he was the winner of the Stalin Peace Prize. He's put on par with Grotowski and Artaud, sometimes even Stanislavski, but they were very different people that pioneered in very different ways. His left stuck art today almost frequently performed more than the works of Shakespeare and Oscar Wilde put together, and are treated with the uttermost respect, as they are commodities that showcase an amazing revolutionary figure in theatre. He risked expulsion from his school in 1915 for labelling the phrase "dulce et decorum est pro patria mori," is sweet and proper to die for the fatherland, as filthy propaganda designed to dull people's minds. Brecht was very outspoken about his opinions, many owed to his upbringing in a Protestant environment. His mother, Sophie Brecht, was a loud and boisterous woman who disagreed with how Germany was being run. He stated very clearly that he disliked, nay, he had a hatred for illusion, especially in theatre. Any production that he thought didn't show things as they were, or the creators pretended that the events that occurred in the plays were realistic and plausible when it was only just poetic license. He wanted to bring truth to people. Most styles up to then were very fictional and were what he considered untruthful. He focused on reality, on portraying things as they were in actuality. In an age of science brought about by the Second Industrial Revolution, he put a very sociological and scientific use to his theatre. He saw it as a way to make theatre actually teach the masses through entertainment and get other playwrights to see its use as a tool. His epic theatre was inspired by German expressionism. Expressionism is a style that is very surreal in its approach, taking real-life stories and twisting the presentation to get the viewers to interpret the subject matter in a different way, altering them to be artistic statements that would appeal to almost any crowd. Expressionism has evolved over the years, getting more abstract in some regards, and so now when we compare epic theatre to it, they seem almost completely juxtaposed to each other. Modern expressionist theatre is almost classified as unreal, illusory, and totally separated from reality. Epic theatre seems grounded and firmly set as a realistic interpretation of the world, just with a certain lens. Brecht also took inspiration from Marxism, the basis of communism, but his plays were not Marxist in their stories and character profiles, though many of the morals and beliefs he hoped to communicate to the masses would be familiar to any Russians in the audience. Also, on his trip to China early in his life, he may have gotten some ideas from the Beijing theatre of the early 20th century, but you wouldn't have known to look at it. Despite having strongly affected him when he viewed it, the only practice he took from it was the physicality of the geisha, and the only time China appears in his works is in The Good Person of Szechuan. In actuality, he had a greater effect on Chinese theatre than it did on him, as his introduction of epic theatre to them led to a minor artistic revolution. Now, Brecht wouldn't have been nearly as successful, and his style would never have been so densely constructed and intricately built without his good partner Erwin Piscator. Piscator made up his own style of theatre before Brecht even touched on the notion of the epic, creating what he dubbed political theatre. This style too, over time, has become absorbed to the point where it is almost a subcategory of theatre, as using theatre as a way to teach and instruct others is a common theme in many modern plays. Political theatre provided much inspiration for Brecht's themes, but most of the work that went into developing epic theatre was Brecht's own. Everything from the techniques, acting styles, plot devices and settings were of his own design. They collaborated together on the plays Rasputin and The Good Soldier Schweik, and Brecht was even the best man at Erning's wedding. I mean, these guys were tight. Epic theatre was considered contemporary and revolutionary, though not quite as out there as its expressionism. So naturally, when it came about back in the Second Industrial Revolution, it really took off, because as you know, the ruling class loves brand spanking new stuff. All through the 20s and 30s, epic theatre was one of the most prominent and influential styles in the whole of Europe. It became very popular with the masses, so in January 1949, Brecht started East Berlin's Berliner Ensemble with wife Helene Weigel at Duchess Theatre. Helene featured in many of his premiere performances, as she was quite talented and a natural actress, and managed the acting company after her husband's death. Let's talk about what was in these plays. How might we describe a Brechtian performance? Well, the stories tended to focus on series of events instead of just taking place within a chronological day or time span. The plot happened over time, progressing through different locations, dates and scenes. Sometimes items like side stories and possible plot stimuli were introduced early in the story and didn't seem to immediately do anything, but foreshadowed something to come in a later scene. The fortune-telling near the very start of Mother Courage and Her Children was an example of foreshadowing things to come.
Draw and see what a welcome the world has in store for you.
By the time a performance reached its second act, most of the characters would have been introduced, leaving room for development and further conflict. This meant the plot and conflicts were central and ongoing instead of multiple conflicts and characters having to share the spotlight throughout the play. Actors in epic theatre were traditionally dressed in simple costume, because that style of performance utilised characters whose individuality and personality were portrayed mainly through their acting. The characters they played were seldom very memorable or iconic, except for one familiar face that crops up now and again, as the style was partly decentralised from the acting and focused more on plot and stories. Most all the fictional characters were designed plainly, each with one or two motives and somewhat archetypal. Having only a few elements to them provided an opportunity for the actors to portray them very powerfully and not let their performances get diluted with too many factors. The characters never hid what they were thinking, never hiding their feelings. Motives were clear to the audience, present in the conscious mind of the actor, shown through the face and physicality. Relationships between characters, especially the evolution that was owed to important events within a scene, were always obvious and easily seen. A fight between two characters on stage, even never explicitly stated in dialogue, was evident, and the conflicting motives were easy to pick. Brecht left nothing to chance when writing and directing his plays, never left things to figure out in case audiences didn't quite make the right guess. And that's not what the plays were about. They were made to teach and instruct the masses and educate people so that they may be more aware of the world around them. He made it so any of his performances may be observed in whole without the viewers getting lost in their thoughts or predictions on how the play may progress. Humour was a powerful device used often, though it's not the kind of slapstick Three Stooge-esque humour found in Jim Carrey movies. Baden-Baden Lessons on Consent is the only example of slapstick ever found in one of his works, but the purpose behind that skit was more than to entertain. Often laughter from the audience, he reminisced later, came from those individuals who understood the stupidity of a certain situation people have put themselves in, and the relationship between characters better than the characters themselves. and either found them ridiculous or saw the characters finally come to understand everything that they already knew. As aforementioned, the cast acted with strong emotion and were convincing in roles deliberately for the audience's benefit, not just to show off their acting skills, but to keep the audience focused. They delivered dialogue and sang with fervour, and very realistically considering it was not realism and was intended to completely oppose that style, but distanced themselves from the roles offstage and on. They still performed in the personas of who they were cast as, but were reminded constantly, internally, that the character they portrayed was just a character, and they didn't need to emotionally identify with them. They performed to engage the audience, and yet still the audience could view with detachment, distancing themselves much like those on stage. Never mind. The distancing effect was the name given by Brecht to the technique that he always tried to instill into his actors, and into himself whenever writing his scripts. He found that it helped his viewers to enjoy the plays critically and more cleverly, when they weren't getting too swept up in all the drama. It was almost as if the viewers were looking through a window or viewing a painting in an art gallery, appreciating the view as opposed to if they were viewing realism, where a more proper analogy would be smashing that window and replacing one of the people on stage, becoming a part of the play instead of viewing the events depicted. He wanted his viewers to remember they were only spectators and that the things shown on stage were not really happening. He would even let his off-stage crew remain visible on the stage, changing the scenery live, playing music in the background, or managing the stage in the right wing. This, along with how he tried to make the facts obvious, as mentioned before, made it very easy for his audiences to understand what was happening and get how the plays related to the world. Historification was another technique he employed, that he used frequently when he thought of the settings of the events of one of his plays. He often would set them in the past, maybe putting the story in the French Revolution, in war-stricken 1624 Sweden, or right in the midst of the Third Reich. When he set a play in the past, it was for a specific reason, to teach a certain lesson, or to draw parallels with current issues occurring in his home of Germany. This also allowed the viewers emotional detachment, as most of them would not have been present, or could not relate personally to the events depicted. Mostly he tended to set his works in war, because every writer has their favourite genres. He was very anti-war, and he collated a book of horrific images from magazine clippings to go along with many of his own striking poems, dubbing the volume War Primer. There were many influences and inspirations that became the dialectal theatre style of Brecht, many picked up in his childhood and adolescence. In some ways his theatre, for instance, was slightly Marxist, the values favoured by the pre-communist political minds like Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin were very present in the way he wrote the characters and incorporated themes into his stories. But he was not a Marxist disciple at heart. The existence of each of his plays were often quite obvious and apparent in their purposes. Man Equals Man was about equality. The Caucasian Chalk Circle was about class conflicts and parenthood. The Good Person of Szechuan was about poverty and the inevitability of evil eventually caused by all people with good intentions. Fear and Misery of the Third Reich was purely anti-Nazi, and The Life of Galileo solely functioned as a biography. But sometimes their morals and lessons were not so clear-cut, and the motivations behind some more vague and detailed works were regularly lost. As in the most famous of his plays and the most popularly performed by amateurs of this millennium, Mother Courage and Her Children had a few layers to its story. It seemed to say war is bad, but arguably the underlying omnipresent theme is how peasants were treated by soldiers and the middle class. And to a lesser extent, the message of don't smack your children was there too. He who says yes, which is paired with he who says no, poses a moral dilemma. A boy needs to get medicine for his sick mother, but he himself gets afflicted along the way and his companion must decide to go on or to forfeit the journey and save the boy. This is quite obviously a philosophical question to the audience, but as it is, it has no one answer, and therefore no one purpose other than to get people to think deeply. The Threepenny Opera covers high-class relations, crime, corruption in the workforce. The commissioner of the local police station is secretly helping out Mac the Knife, Germany's most infamous and wanted criminal. And there's also a guy who makes a living out of dressing up homeless people so they can beg for money and he can get a share of the air intake. Jesus, I thought Earth's air was polluted. A Brechtian stage typically featured minimalistic props and simple stage decorations. Not because Brecht was on a budget, but because epic theatre was a very small-scale operation when it came to dressing up a play. Brecht believed that fancy schmancy painted walls and velvet curtains would distract the audience from the play and its focuses. Also, any of the little props allowed were mostly symbolic in nature, reflecting the themes and atmosphere the play had. All of them provided some function other than to look pretty, sometimes just as, or even more valuable than minor characters. However, when some of the more successful Löschstück were adapted to film, the set designer had a much harder time, as the studios were more extravagantly decorated and realistic props, as well as background props with no function but setting, were added. Some of his higher-end productions included screen projection. Brecht got that idea from Irwin. This was the main effect Bertolt used that was not so realistic and utilised illusion, which he had a disliking, nay, a hatred for, and was mainly found in his collabs with Piscator. Most of the music composed was played on stringed instruments and drums, with the drums doubling as sound effects like gunshots or explosions. Sometimes sound effects provided were vocal. For filming of any Löschstück plays or movies, no fancy techniques were ever used, but most filming was comparably very basic at that time. No tricky camera movement or effects. However, Brecht's movies were some of the first to feature sound, maybe to better demonstrate the story and emotions. Now, how has it evolved after Brecht died and left his disciples to continue on his traditions? Jesus, I made him sound like Jesus. Well, it lives on almost completely intact in only the individual original performances written by Brecht's own hand, the Löschstück. But there has been a recent increase in new plays and movies that pay homage to his magnificent work and use the techniques he innovated that stay very true to form and use the same style of acting. A notable new-ish movie is in the style of Brecht is Lars von Trier's Dogville, starring Nicole Kidman and Paul Bettany. It is set completely in a soundstage, with sections of the floor mapped out to show different locations in a small town. The barren stage uses only essential props and set designs to help direct attention, as Bertolt Brecht always strived to do, to the plot and the characters. For those who were not familiar at the time with Brecht's work, particularly film critics, they labelled it as experimental and even misanthropic because of the blunt portrayal of events of evil that can arise in human beings. But thankfully, praise for the film has been steadily increasing, particularly in critical reviews. Brecht's efforts, of course, are also found in the continuing shows of the Berliner Ensemble in Germany, but their shows are mostly new and written this century for a new audience, and their styles become more expressionist and surreal. Some of their stuff looks really disturbing too, especially the stuff shown at the moment, which seems to be satanic in their themes. I would recommend it, Miller. Even the big acting ensembles performing epics like Mother Courage and Threepenny Opera stay true to methods. They act with a melodramatic yet realistic quality, use the usual sound effects, and the backstage helpers and musicians are still visible on set. Music has improved, so naturally, finding their way onto stage before simple instruments. The main change has been lighting, which since then has come a long way. Most theatres have adopted coloured LEDs, but the usage of pretty lighting like they have in Broadway is seldom, and epics today often have not adapted or overstated the lighting Brecht first wrote into the scripts. Epic theatre still continues to this day to inspire audiences, actors, and playwrights. Epic theatre has influenced theatre practical, got people to think, and was used throughout the 20th century to discuss issues in a similar, yet longer-lasting manner than Piscator's more political style. Though notable modern examples like Trash Cuisine, which focuses on abolishing the death penalty in Belarus, is conducted in a familiar style. But epic theatre, as a genre, has dissolved almost completely because it changed theatre so damn much, it was so damn innovative, sorry for swearing repeatedly, that other styles kept borrowing techniques, and new theatrical entrepreneurs wouldn't stop taking pieces to develop new styles and genres, so often that basically nothing was left. Lehrstuck was such a revolutionary dynamic that calling a play epic nowadays would have people saying, "Oh, the Brechtian show I saw was just like realism," or "I saw this expressionist performance last week, Barbara, and it's so similar to Brecht's works." Never mind. Historification is now found in books and film everywhere you look, not just on the stage. Some may argue that this is not Brecht's doing, that this idea was popular before he entered the scene. I did at first. But it really was only present in William Shakespeare's works and certain early historical novels. And how much did Shakespeare do, eh? That's right, he did pretty much everything that Brecht did. They were both top innovators of theatre. They both came up with their own original ideas, and they were both European. So yeah, it did exist before, but you'll find that historical works were not nearly as popular before Brecht came along and created. Now, would he have been really disappointed in us for taking all this stuff and putting it into realism, modern realism, which he despised at the time. He hated, remember? We've taken almost everything out of his plays and put it into modern realism to effectively create the one overbearing style that everyone uses today. But I don't know. I'll leave that up to you to decide. Now, I leave you with a set of quotes from the man himself, and hope you were informed by this video of how amazing Bertolt Brecht and epic theatre were. And remember, from the cradle to the coffin, underwear comes first. So profound.